All right. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the Ask an Expert webinar series. We'll get started now. It's the top of the hour, 1 o'clock. It's so nice to be with all of you. I can't see our full participant list right now from the view that I've got because I'm sharing my screen, but I do know that we had a lot of people registered for this session, and I am really looking forward to hearing your questions at the end. My name is Tika Newton. I am the International Watershed Coordinator for the Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation. I also work part-time for the International Joint Commission, and many other partners around the Rainy Lake of the Woods Basin join us in this work. I'm joining you today from my home just outside Kenora in Treaty 3 territory. I'm really happy to have you all here and to be joined today by three exceptional speakers, three research scientists who have worked in the basin, continue to work in the basin, and they'll be giving us some information about the research that they do. But before I get started on the actual webinar, I'm just going to go through a little bit of housekeeping here. So first of all, the Ask an Expert webinar series is an opportunity for those of us who work on watershed issues to share with the wider world the work that we do, and to give you as an audience an opportunity to ask us questions. Our hope is that by opening up these discussions, we can learn from one another and strengthen the relationships that help us to better care for this place that we all love. So far this year, we've recorded two webinars back in the spring. We did one on May 15th, focused on watershed governance and understanding who does what in the Rainy Lake of the Woods watershed. On June 5th, we did a second webinar that looked at community-led monitoring initiatives and aquatic invasive species. You can find all of these recordings on the Lake of the Woods Water Sustainability Foundation's website, and I'll post the link to the webinars in the chat in a few minutes. You can find it at the blog on the website. Before we get started on the content of the webinar, I just wanted to quickly review a couple of the functions on Zoom in case you're not familiar with Zoom or you haven't used it for a while. You can access the taskbar in your Zoom interface by just scrolling down to the bottom of your screen, and you'll see the icons that allow you to toggle between mute and unmute, to post a question, raise your hand, or post something in the chat. I'll be moderating this talk today. I'll keep an eye on the Q&A, the raised hands, and the chat, so feel free to use all three. I would ask that you keep yourself muted, and I will unmute people as necessary to ask questions at the end. And then you can use the reaction button at the bottom to raise your hand. Remember that in the chat, Zoom records all the chat conversation, including private bilateral chats that you're having. So make sure that you keep that in mind. Okay, and now, oh, and Todd just texted me to say that the chat's disabled. Okay, so never mind about the chat. Just use the raise hand and Q&A function. That'll work just fine. So now let's turn to today's presentations. If you read our blog post that we used to promote this webinar, you'll recall that we discussed the context in which we're bringing you this topic today. The summer of 2023 has been one for the record books. Heat waves, the like of which scientists tell us we'd not have seen without the amplifying effects of climate change, have crippled all parts of the world. Fires have been ripping through places as diverse as Canada, Portugal, Hawaii. We've seen flooding in Italy and China. We've seen fires in South America during the peak of their winter. While our area here in northwestern Ontario, northern Minnesota, southern Manitoba has been living through a moderate drought this year, other parts of the continent have been inundated with extreme and deadly flooding. Climate change is no longer a future threat, but something that's happening all around us. It's measurable and it has an impact on our daily lives. But what are those impacts regionally, locally, where we live? What does science actually tell us about how climate is changing things here in our watershed? Is the Rainy Lake of the Woods area more or less severely impacted than other noteworthy parts of the globe? And what specifically is most affected here? What impacts have raised the biggest concerns for climate scientists? Today, I'm joined by three leading climate researchers in our region who will help us to unpack some of these questions. Over the next 40 minutes or so, we'll share with you information about how scientists have measured climate change and its effects on freshwater lakes, fish, and overall ecology of our area. Each speaker is going to give a short presentation, and then we'll have time at the end of the webinar for questions and answers. And remember, again, you can use the Q&A function or raise your hand to be able to activate Zoom controls and get questions through to us. I'll keep an eye on things as we go. So let me just introduce our speakers, and then I'm going to hand it over to the first of them. So we're joined today by three speakers. Our first speaker today will be Dr. Scott Higgins, who will set a bit of a context for what we know about climate change based on records and research done at the International Institute for Sustainable Development Experimental Lakes area just east of Kenora. Scott is a senior research scientist at the ELA and a past research scientist for Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Dr. Higgins' work focuses on algal ecology, primary production, climate change, and the effects of invasive species on freshwater ecosystems. As a graduate student and postdoctoral fellow at the University of Waterloo, Dr. Higgins' research on water quality in the Laurentian Great Lakes and Lake Malawi, Africa, for the University of Waterloo and the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, and on the ecological effects of invasive species on aquatic ecosystems for the University of Wisconsin Center for Limnology. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Claire Nelligan, who will share with us some of the work she did during the course of her graduate and postgraduate research, looking at paleoecological data to track climate change from prehistoric times to present and the impacts that these changes have had on cold water lake fish species like lake trout. Claire is a graduate of the Pearl Lab at Queen's. Pearl stands for Paleoecological Environmental Assessment and Research Lab. Her doctoral research was with Dr. John Small and focused on using lake sediments to assess long-term environmental trends in Ontario lakes that support lake trout. Following her graduate studies, Claire joined the Great Lakes Unit at the Ontario Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks and completed a postdoctoral fellowship focusing on agricultural nutrient loads at the Laurentian Great Lakes Basin. Claire now works as an aquatic scientist at Minnow Aquatic Environmental Services. And finally, Dr. Leif Olmanson will talk to us about some of the fascinating work he's been doing using satellite remote sensing tools to measure climate change impacts to Minnesota's freshwater lakes, including in the Rainy Lake of the Woods Basin. Leif is a researcher at the University of Minnesota with over 20 years experience developing remote sensing applications to create temporally and spatially rigorous data sets of water and land resources for large area ecosystem characterization. He's particularly interested in developing field-validated image processing methods implemented in automated geospatial analysis systems such as Google Earth's engine and the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute's supercomputers to gain a better understanding of the natural environment. He led a team of researchers and computer scientists to build a near real-time water quality monitoring system for Minnesota's more than 10,000 lakes using satellite imagery to provide critical water quality information for lake management and recreation. He's currently expanding the water quality monitoring system to other areas. So I'm going to turn it over now to Scott. And after we hear from all three presenters, we're going to do questions and answers. So store those up, put them in the Q&A, and remember you can post them at any time. And let's get going. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and let Scott take it away. Thanks. Oh, unmute yourself, Scott.
Thank you. Thanks for that great introduction too. So I'm very happy to be here today and talk about climate change in the Lake of the Woods Basin. And I'm going to be talking about the insights that we've learned from our long-term monitoring program at the IISD Experimental Lakes area. And when I say long-term, it's going to be our second speaker is going to talk about really long-term, and I'm going to be talking about the past 50 years or so. So to situate us geographically, you can see in the top picture on the slide is where we're located, the Experimental Lakes area. So we're just southeast of Kenora, about 60 kilometers as the crow flies. And you can see by the bottom picture, which is our field station, that the lakes around and the watersheds around are relatively undisturbed. This is sort of a remote region and there's very little human development. And that's really important for us because when we're looking at effects of climate change, we don't want to have the effects of other stressors of human activities of development. Now, at our research station since 1969, we've had a long-term monitoring program that has examined the meteorology. We have an on-site weather station that we cooperate with Environment Canada. And we also look at the hydrology, the limnology, and the fisheries. And so this is a really great opportunity to tie those components back to the climate components. And from the air, this is what the area would look like. And this is part of Canada's boreal forest. What you may or may not know is the boreal forest in Canada makes up about 50% of Canada's landmass. And on average, 30% of that landmass is covered by lakes, sort of interspersed with these forests. And much of it is north of the cities and the towns are where most Canadians live. And so there's many areas look just like this one. Now, when we think of climate change, I think the first thing we tend to think about is air temperature. And the effects at ELA are no different than anywhere else around the planet. We're seeing increased air temperatures. And if you look at the graphs on the left of your slide, there's a top graph and a bottom graph, and it's exact same data. So the top graph is a line plot, and the bottom graph is what the IPCC would use, and it's called an anomaly plot. And what it's showing is the zero horizontal zero line is the long-term average, and any green bar that's is above the long-term average, and any red bar is below the long-term average. And it's just an easy way to look at the data. And it's really clear when you look at either of these plots that the mean annual air temperature is increasing. And it's increasing at a rate that's much faster than the global average, about 1.5 degrees Celsius since 1970. But that is fairly common for our latitude, all right? So anywhere else at that latitude would be warming at a similar rate. But what that mean annual air temperature, that rate of change, is actually deceiving in many ways because the seasonality is really important. And what I'm doing in this graph is comparing the most recent full decade, 2011 to 2020, to the air temperatures back in 1970 or 1979, and splitting it up based on season. And what you see is actually that the winter and the autumn are warming up much faster than the other seasons. And in fact, during the spring and summer, it's actually warmer in this most recent decade than it was back in 1970 to 79. But it's not significant or statistically significant because there's a lot of variation in the mean annual air temperatures. And so it may become significant in the next little while, but right now it's winter and autumn that are driving these mean annual changes. And that's really important when you think about lakes, which are ice covered in the winter. And you might say, well, why is it so important if the winter air temperatures change? Now, it matters for a lot of reasons. It might matter to us as if we're recreational fishermen or fisherwomen, and we have less time to go out in the lakes. It affects ice safety in terms of there's been increased people falling through the ice in the spring, especially. And it also affects ice roads. And this is really important to many communities in northwestern Ontario and northern Manitoba that do not have permanent roads that lead to their communities. And these ice roads are critical for bringing in heavy construction materials and fuel during the wintertime. And that period of where it's safe to drive on these ice roads is becoming shorter and shorter and shorter. And we're really concerned that in the next 25 to 50 years, that these ice roads simply will not be safe to drive on anymore. So this is a real issue, and it's real targeted to many of the communities that live in these areas. Now, air temperature also affects water temperature, and this is really important to keep in mind. Most animals that live in the water are not mammals like us, and they don't regulate their own body temperatures. Instead of being endotherms, they're ectotherms. And so they take on the temperature of the water that's around them. And so as that water heats up, it has a number of consequences. One of the biggest consequences is it affects their metabolic rates, and the effects are nonlinear. So small increases in water temperature can mean large increases in their metabolic rate. And that means they need to eat more food just to maintain their body size or maintain their growth rates. So as water temperatures increase, we would expect to see declines in growth rates if animals cannot keep up, increase their feeding rates at the same rate. And for the lakes that we're talking about, most of the lakes in our region are fairly low productivity lakes. They're food limited. And so these increases in water temperature, these fish or in other animals simply can't get enough food. And so we'd expect their body size to decline. Now, I'm going to use an example organism here, a cold water fish known as lake trout. And lake trout is probably the most popular recreational fish in our area, and it's a cold water fish. So it likes water temperatures below 15 degrees Celsius. And in the graph on the left, what it is there's been a number of lake trout that were tagged, and we can see their position in the water column over the season. And you can see in the spring, they're up in the shallow depths and they're feeding. But as summer comes along and the surface water temperatures increase, they go down into the deep water areas of the lake. But they run into another problem there, is that they require dissolved oxygen concentrations higher than about 6 milligrams per liter. And even in our clean oligotrophic lakes, we get anoxia at the bottom of those lakes from the breakdown of organic matter. And that anoxic layer builds over the summer. So you can see as summer progresses into fall, you get this squeeze where it's too hot in the surface waters as the thermocline gets deeper. And the anoxic layer rises in the water column, and these fish are squeezed to narrower and narrower habitats. And in some cases, they'll overlap, and there's simply no optimal habitat for lake trout. And what we would expect and what we've already seen in our data is reduced growth rates of fish and leading to reduced size at age. So a lake trout that's 7 years old is no longer the same size as it was a 7-year-old lake trout, 10 or 20 years ago. Now, what we often don't think about are when we think about climate change, is the effects of precipitation. And as you'll see, they're incredibly important for Lake of the Woods. They're incredibly important for all lakes. And the question is, have we seen an increase in rainfall? And the answer is absolutely yes. So what this graph is showing is the annual total precipitation. The light gray dots is actually a meteorological station in Kenora that has records back to the early 1900s. So 1916, I believe, was the first record. And what happened was there's a paper by Parker et al. In 2009 showing that precipitation has traditionally followed a 31-year cycle. It goes up, it goes down, it goes up, it goes down. Well, what happened in the 1990s is it went up and it stayed up and it's never come back down. So if this graph was extended till today, you would see these high precipitation rates remaining very high. They're variable year to year, but on average, they're remaining fairly high. And this is a big issue. Now, when it rains, of course, it doesn't just rain on the surface of a lake, it rains on the watershed too. So increased precipitation means increased connectivity between the lake and its watershed, and increased sensitivity to the land use on that watershed. So it could be nutrients, it could be contaminants, but increased rainfall is going to increase the flow of those things into our lakes. Now, I'm going to use Lake Winnipeg as an example. And in this case, the watershed of Lake Winnipeg has both urban components, but is also highly agricultural. There's algal blooms that occur in Lake Winnipeg every year, and they're massive. And the province of Manitoba and the city of Winnipeg are trying to address this. They are upgrading one of our sewage treatment plants in Winnipeg at the cost of estimated $1.8 billion to deal with this algal bloom problem. However, this is going to be just the start, because the large blooms that occur in Lake Winnipeg are also related to climate change. And I'm going to show you a graph of that right now. Now, this graph is fairly complex, but let me take you through it. On the x-axis, we go from 1960 to 2010. And the first point in blue, number 1, is the Red River discharge. And you can see that small black line. And from 1960 to 1990 or so, it was highly variable, but it has remained at sort of a constant overall level. Starting in 1990, though, or shortly after, the increased rainfall in the region has increased the discharge of the Red River considerably. The second point is the phosphorus concentration within the Red River. You might think that the increased amount of water that's moving through the Red River might dilute phosphorus concentrations, but it hasn't. It's actually increased phosphorus concentrations. And that has pushed up the overall loading of phosphorus into Lake Winnipeg considerably. And that leads us to our third point in terms of the phytoplankton biomass. Phytoplankton biomass has tripled or quadrupled since the 1960s, 1970s, and through that 1990s period. So we're getting much larger blooms than we used to, and this is related to climate change. So this is just an example how climate change can really affect the sensitivity of lakes to land use. Now, in boreal lakes, like the ones near the experimental lakes area, don't have high agricultural use, and their watersheds are mostly forested. Here, the issue is called brownification, and many north temperate lakes are experiencing this. And this is where lakes move from fairly clear water that you see on the top left glass towards darker colors towards the right. And that's because the increased rainfall is moving through the soils in the watershed and moving through wetlands and peatlands and picking up this organic matter that's darkly stained. This dissolved organic carbon, or DOC, has large effects on the physics of lakes. And here's a few examples. This is the thermocline depth. So that's the depth of that warm surface layer. In the low DOC lakes, it could be about 10 meters deep. But as you move to the higher DOC lakes, it becomes restricted to about 5 meters. The effects on the photic depth are even more striking. And this is incredibly important for lake food webs, because the photic depth is the maximum depth to which plants can grow. And of course, that's plants and algae, and these are the base of aquatic food webs. And so at low DOC, algae can grow down to about 20 meters, but in high DOC lakes, it can only grow down to about 5 meters. So this is about a 75% reduction in habitat. The DOC is also a challenge for drinking water facilities. It can cause disinfectant byproducts, such as trihalomethane, which are carcinogen for humans. And so it's a real problem. It also affects lake food webs and productivity. So here's a couple of examples. In some recent work that we've done at the ELA, we've shown that increases in dissolved organic carbon reduce algal growth rates by about 20% or 70%. And this effect cascades to the higher trophic levels, such as zooplankton, which also decline by about 70%. And the research looking into the effects on fish is ongoing, but it looks like it's declining in similar ways. Now, lastly, I wanted to say this increase in rainfall is also leading, as we've said, to more DOC being stripped from wetlands or watershed soils and wetlands and moving into lakes. And in the short term, this means more CO2 and methane going up to the atmosphere. About 16 to 20% of the DOC that comes into a lake is emitted back to the atmosphere. Another 40% is sedimented out, and the rest goes out the outflow. So the bad news is, in the short term, more precipitation means more CO2 emissions. But there's a good side to this too, and that is over the long term, and we're talking hundreds of years. Remember that many of these forests are fire forests, and we've seen a lot of forest fires. That carbon that's stored in the trees and in the soils would have been burnt and sent off to the atmosphere. So if it's sent into a lake and it's buried in the bottom of a lake, well, that's not going to burn. And so that's an important permanent burial site for carbon. And so what we've seen is climate change is not something of the future. It's already being occurring for a long period of time. But when we look into the climate forecasts and predictions, they suggest that we're moving into a new climate envelope. As I've said, summer air temperatures have not changed a lot. They are predicted to change considerably by 2050. So we can expect to see longer periods of stratification, more deep water anoxia. There's going to be more issues like that. And these increased precipitation, the models suggest that's here to stay in our part of the world. And so we expect that watershed management is going to be even more important. With that, I'd like to say thank you very much, and I will pass over the reins to our next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Scott. And Claire, you're up next.
Thanks, Scott. I'm just gonna get my slides set up. 1 second. All right, so Scott did a really great job of kind of introducing some of the themes I'm going to be talking about in my talk as well. I'm going to be presenting some of the work I did for my PhD research, and essentially today we're going to be talking about what lake sediments can tell us about climate change and what that means for cold water fish such as lake trout. So as a bit of an introduction on lake trout are a widely distributed cold water taxon. They're found in cold, deep, well-oxygenated lakes characteristic of the Canadian Shield. In Ontario, lake trout lakes are relatively rare. Only 1% of Ontario's 250,000 lakes support a lake trout population. Lake trout are large-bodied, late-maturing fish, and they also have very specific habitat requirements for temperature and dissolved oxygen, which Scott pointed out quite well through his figures. But because of this, it makes them good ecological indicators, whereby protecting lake trout also indirectly protects habitat for other cold water fish species. Within Lake of the Woods, lake trout are present in many of the northern bays. In the 1980s, lake trout were known to be impacted by multiple stressors within the system, such as overharvesting, as well as water quality issues associated with low dissolved oxygen, as well as excessive algal growth. There have been recent improvements in the lake trout fishery within Lake of the Woods. They've seen increases in the lake trout population, increases in spawning success, and reduction in mortalities. However, concerns remain specifically with respect to the number of large-sized individuals within the system. So just to look at the habitat requirements for lake trout a little bit more closely, lake trout's usable habitat is defined as water with a temperature less than 15 degrees Celsius and with oxygen above 4 milligrams per liter. But their optimal habitat, as Scott mentioned again, is much narrower. It's actually water with temperature less than 10 degrees Celsius and above an oxygen concentration of 6 milligrams per liter. And so what happens over the course of a summer or over the course of a season is that the water at the top of the lake, so the warm water on the top, becomes increasingly warm and moves a little further down into the water column. So that compresses the lake trout habitat from the surface. And at the same time, we have fish living in the bottom of the lake. We have organisms that are respiring, and we also have organic matter that's decomposing, and all that's using up oxygen. And so at the same time, we have lower oxygen that's acting to squeeze the habitat available for lake trout together. And so there's not as much over the course of a season. And although this process will happen somewhat naturally in lakes that undergo this kind of thermal structure, the concern is that with climate change, this compression of this habitat squeeze will become longer and more prolonged and intense. And so a big focus of my PhD research was to better understand these oxygen dynamics that are happening within these lake trout systems. And so what are the variables that influence deep water oxygen? There's a couple big ones at play, and again, Scott kind of brought all these up, which is great. So it's a good primer. But the big ones that we're going to focus on today are nutrients, so total phosphorus, dissolved organic carbon, so that component that was associated with the brownification of water, as well as climate warming. So when we talk about nutrients in lake systems, we're essentially talking about food for algae. The main nutrient that we are focused on here is total phosphorus, and the more total phosphorus you have, the more algae you'll typically have in a lake. However, when all that algal biomass dies, essentially it'll sink to the bottom of the lake and decompose, and that decomposition uses up oxygen. So typically in lakes where we have increased nutrients, we typically see lower concentrations of dissolved oxygen at the bottom of the lake. Climate warming also can influence the amount of oxygen at the bottom of the lake because it influences how a lake will set up its thermal structure. So when we think of a typical lake in Ontario, they mix twice a year. So when the ice goes off in the spring, the water's cold. Everything's the same temperature. And because of this, the water can mix freely, and that introduces oxygen from the atmosphere into the bottom of the lake. But as we know, things heat up in the summer, which establishes this layer of warm water on the surface of the lake. This layer on the water, on the surface, it can mix freely, but it actually creates a physical barrier between the atmosphere and the bottom of the lake. And so no new oxygen is being introduced to those bottom waters. And as we all kind of know, fall comes, everything mixes again, and that's the time of the year where the oxygen gets to be replenished. And so in lakes, or typical lakes in Ontario, this cycle happens naturally. But with climate change, what happens, it can lead to longer and stronger periods of this thermal structure or thermal stratification occurring. And because of that, it results in longer periods where that bottom of the lake is isolated from the atmosphere, so longer periods of dissolved oxygen depletion or low oxygen that's occurring. So we have increased warming could equal less oxygen. And finally, the last component that we're going to talk about is dissolved organic carbon. And as Scott was saying, dissolved organic carbon is typically what gives water that brownish color, what people refer to as tea stain sometimes, typically from the terrestrial environment, such as for wetlands. And it can play a role in lake oxygen dynamics because it influences how that lake thermal structure sets up. So if the surface of the water is a little bit browner, that means that more heat is being absorbed quickly into those surface waters. And so that warm layer at the top is a little bit shallower. And because of that, there's actually more volume of the lake below in that deep water, which could offer more cold water habitat for fish. DOC is also interesting because it could also be a component of that decomposition that happens. So it's a thing that could either increase the volume of the oxygenated habitat within a lake, but it could also result in decreased oxygen at the bottom as well. So it's a little bit here and there. But all that to say is things are complex. Unlike the experimental lakes area, most systems are not isolated from other stressors. Things are occurring alongside land use change, food web shifts, shoreline development, and all along that backdrop of climate change. But how does this all relate to lake sediments? That's what we're going to get into now. So lakes are essentially natural archives. Material from the catchment, as well as the atmosphere and things that are within the lake itself, eventually will settle to the bottom of the lake. And this happens continuously. And because of this, you can collect a lake sediment core, which leaves a record of the past environment in which it was formed and allows us to kind of read the sediments like a book from past to present. So the study of lake sediment cores falls under the field of paleolimnology, which is essentially the study of the biological, chemical, and physical indicators preserved within lake sediments. Typically, these cores are dated, and you can go back in time depending on the length of the core, really. But it's very interesting. But when we talk about indicators in lake sediments, what do we mean? Essentially, indicators are things that can be preserved or noted within the sediments. They're identifiable, and they also give an indication of what the physical environment was like at the time that this indicator was formed. And so the two indicators that we're going to be talking about today are diatoms and chironomids. Diatoms are a type of algae. Their cell walls are essentially made out of glass that is preserved in the sediment. And these cell walls are very ornate and unique. And you can identify these diatoms to a very high level, to species level often. And you can see on the slide, this is a picture of what they look like under a microscope. They're very beautiful. Diatoms are sensitive to changes in their environment, and they also have very specific and well-defined environmental optima and tolerances. So we understand which species like to live in which kind of environments. And we can use them to look at trends in climate as well as in trends in nutrient concentrations within a lake. Chironomids are the other type of indicator that we're going to be talking about. The common name for chironomids are non-biting midges. Sometimes people refer to them as bloodworms as well. There's an aquatic larval stage for chironomids. And as the chironomid grows, it'll leave this head capsule, which is preserved within the sediments. And that's what's shown in the first three pictures here. These head capsules are very unique and specific to the type of chironomid that's present. And the chironomids are known to have specific environmental preferences for oxygen. So we can understand lake oxygen conditions through looking at these chironomids that are present within lake sediment cores. So as part of my graduate work, we looked at three areas within Lake of the Woods: Echo Bay, Cul-de-sac Bay, and Whitefish Bay. Sediment cores were collected from all of these locations, and we looked at various types of paleolimnological indicators within these cores, and I'm going to be presenting some of those results right now. So as just a quick summary of the diatom results that we found, along the bottom, these are some pictures that I took on the microscope of some of the species of diatoms that we found in these sediment cores. What we generally saw was a shift in the types of species that were in the sediment record that were suggestive of enhanced or changes in thermal stratification. So we saw shifts from these heavy silicified taxa, so these really big, are thicker cell-walled species, to those that are small, have a small surface area to volume ratio, and lightly silicified. We noted that the timing of this change varied between the bays, but generally occurred sometime between the 1980s and 2000s. And we also noted, looking at the diatoms, that we saw diatom taxa with higher nutrient optima decrease or remain stable over the sediment record. And so why do we think that change between those small light species is indicative of climate change? And so this comes back into just some lake physics and what happens within the system with the algae. So when we have strongly mixed conditions, that means that all of these diatom taxa can remain suspended in the water column for longer. However, under periods of less mixing or increased thermal stability, we have those heavily silicified taxa, or those bigger species, fall out of the photic zone faster. And what remains are these smaller species or species that can remain suspended for longer. And so it favors certain types of species under these warmer conditions. And that's what we've seen in all three bays of Lake of the Woods. And again, these are just kind of what these small circular taxa look like. We also use the diatoms to reconstruct total phosphorus concentrations going back in time. And just to note again, we're talking about different timescales than what Scott mentioned. Here we're going back to about the mid-1800s, looking at changes over time for total phosphorus. What we saw was no trend in diatom inferred total phosphorus in Echo and Cul-de-sac Bay, but we did see a slight decreasing trend in total phosphorus in Whitefish Bay, starting after about the 1940s. We also use the chironomids to look at or to infer deep water oxygen concentrations. That's what's presented in the graph on the left. It's chironomid inferred volume weighted hypolonitic oxygen, essentially just deep water oxygen. And on the x-axis is the sediment core date. What we can see is that chironomid inferred deep water oxygen decreases starting from the 1900s to the 1990s, and decreases to near anoxic conditions. Interestingly, we do see the slight increase in deep water oxygen occurring in those most recent sediments, so within the last 10, 15 years or so. And we think that this may be associated to an increase in the lake color within some of these bays. But what does this all mean for lake trout? Just to kind of wrap everything up. So the changes that we saw in the sediment record looking at diatoms were suggestive of enhanced thermal stratification, which does present an enhanced risk of dissolved oxygen depletion. So that's something to note as we think about risk to lake trout. When looking at the chironomids and reconstructing deep water oxygen, we observed that oxygen was lower than what it's been historically in cul-de-sac bay, but has increased slightly in recent years. And this is going to require some future monitoring to keep on track of what's happening here. These stressors don't act in isolation, so there's always going to be some influence between these pushes and pulls of what happens to lake oxygen. So future monitoring will be helpful in better understanding this trend moving forward. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to the next presenter.
Thanks, Claire. Take it away, Leith.
Okay, let's see. Oops. Okay, you can see that, right?
Yep, it looks good. Thanks.
Okay, yeah. Okay, I'm going to talk about the work I've been doing using satellite remote sensing for water quality assessments, and kind of how we've automated our image processing procedures with the help of David Porter from the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute, and kind of how we're able to identify lakes that are prone to cyanobacteria blooms, including in the Rainy Lake of the Woods watershed. So what we've done is we have lots of data being collected by system volunteers on our lakes. At the same time, we have satellites regularly collecting imagery. So what we did is basically we took these late summer index periods, so like August, early September imagery, link that up with field measurements within a few days of the image, build a statistical model of the relationship, take that model, apply it to all lakes in an image. We did that for enough images, we came up with a water clarity for the whole state. Using those methods, we completed 9 statewide assessments since 1975. Over 10,000 lakes were included in these assessments. And that was at around 5-year intervals due to the work it takes to do the manual image processing, and then also availability of clear imagery at the time. We use that for analysis, spatial and temporal trends and causal factors. One thing we did back in 2002 is we actually made all of our data available in a lake browser. It's an online resource where anyone can go and get information about their lakes. And that's recently been updated with the data from our new automated system, which will be kind of the focus of the talk. So these days we have a lot better sensors and satellites up there. We have higher spatial, spectral, radiometric, and temporal resolution. So not only can we map water clarity, we can also map the factors that control water clarity, things like the chlorophyll, the phytoplankton, suspended solids, and dissolved organic color. The spectral characteristics of the sensor determine how well different platforms can measure different water quality variables. We look at the bottom left, the graph at the bottom left here. See if just clear water, you're going to have a peak at around 550 nanometers. Once you get chlorophyll in it, you're going to have this peak at around 705. Another trough down around 670 due to photosynthesis. And then another trough at around 620 due to phycocyanin, so indicator of cyanobacteria blooms. If we have dissolved organic, colored dissolved organic matter, the tannin staining or brown stuff in the water, basically that absorbs very strongly in the shorter wavelengths, and that decreases as wavelengths get longer. So here for something on the brown, it's very flat, hardly any signal at all. But once we mix in some things like chlorophyll, you can see a comparison between the green and the yellow line here. You can see how it pulls the shorter wavelengths down, leaves the longer wavelengths intact. So it can still be used for measuring chlorophyll. So we look at the sensors that are available. The kind of the workhorse is Landsat for almost 50 years now. We have one key band we're missing with that. We're missing this red edge band. So it for Landsat, it works really well for water clarity, and it also works really good for the color dissolved organic matter. But if you want chlorophyll, you need some more bands, and that would be the red edge band on the Sentinel-2 satellite. And that does have that. So that's kind of important there. And then if you go to the Sentinel-3, we actually have a really nice band set with the red edge, plus lots of other important bands, and then the phycocyanin band. So with Landsat, one advantage of that is it does have thermal bands. So you can actually measure the surface temperature of water. And then there's the big next thing is going to be Landsat Next, which is quite a ways out, 2030, but it'll be a user designed sensor. So it'll have all the spectral bands of the Sentinel-3 plus some, and then also there'll be 3 of them. So it'll actually be high temporal resolution and a high spatial resolution. So we'll kind of have a really nice sensor at that time, but really we need to work with what we have. So that comes down to Sentinel-2 with the red edge band and fairly high temporal coverage with a 5-day repeat with 2 to 3 days with the overlap areas. So give you an example of what kind of imagery coverage that is. Here we have Sentinel-2 imagery for just August of 2022. And you can see there's quite a bit of imagery. You also notice there's lots of cloud cover. So using our manual techniques, I would not use most of these images. I would be looking for something like this one here, clear throughout, easy to process. But with the automated image processing methods, we're actually able to come up with these masks that actually do a really nice job to get rid of all the clouds, and so we can use all the imagery that's available. So we have the opportunity for near real-time water quality monitoring. That's what we built. We have all this new imagery that's available. It's downloaded to ground stations. From there, we can get it into the machine access in the Minnesota Supercomputing Institute, or we can start doing our image processing procedures. And there we're normalizing the imagery with atmospheric correction, taking the effects of the atmosphere out of the images. And then we do different masks to remove areas that the results would be anomalous. And then from there, we can have just clear water pixels. And from there, we develop our water quality models. And then once we have some water quality models, we can actually make data and maps. And then we put it into our lake browser so people can get access to it. The data we're currently doing is chlorophyll, clarity, and CDOM. And that is daily when clear imagery is available at the lake level. And then for pixel level maps, to make a nice, pretty picture over the whole, all of Minnesota, we do monthly averages. Here's an example of the monthly averages over the Rainy River Lake of the Woods watershed. And this is starting late 2017 was when September 2017 was when the satellite was actually fully operational. So there's less gaps in the data. But you can kind of see there's a few spots where you're hitting these blooms. So we're kind of looking for a needle in a haystack because this is a fairly pristine area with not lots of blooms. But there tend to be more of them coming up, and they are anecdotal. And with this, it seems like they are increasing, which I'll show you some examples of that in a little bit for the area. We got that. Let's go to a more exciting area. This is the Twin City metropolitan area. The red areas are the developed areas, and then the yellowish areas are agricultural. So if we look at do the map for that, similar thing, what we'll find is in kind of around the Twin Cities where there's a lot of agricultural areas, that every late summer you have all these blooms. Tends to be the same lakes that are blooming every year. So they can be identified and actually even model to determine the potential of blooms depending on what the climate conditions are that year. So similar patterns every year, and quite a bit of data to get a good handle on what's going on with our lakes in Minnesota. Now here's the daily data. So here we have Lake Francis. You can see there's quite a few points. This is just 2019. Lake Francis is a mesotrophic lake. We have Tatanka, Washington, Sakata, and German that are all eutrophic lakes. And then we have Elysian, which is a hypereutrophic lake. We can do that for multiple years. You can see that different years have a little bit different climatic conditions. And so you can see how different lakes are affected differently depending on what's going on. For example, like Elysian is, some really big blooms for these 2019, 20, and 21, and less so for the other years. Whereas in 22, Upper Sakata is actually a bigger bloom than the others. There's look at same data, but looking at the map and the seasonal trend at the monthly level. That if we want for monitoring programs, we should have adequate representation to characterize the entire population over space, time, and type. With the satellite data, we have the whole population of lakes over around 10 acres and larger. So we have full data set. In situ data is usually selected by interest. It's usually a lot of volunteers are doing this data, or they're targeting larger lakes. With the one watershed, one plan, they're targeting lakes 500 acres or larger. We have chlorophyll monitor lakes. So what we're finding is compared to the satellite data, the in situ data is targeted towards the larger lakes, also lakes that are lower in chlorophyll, and lakes that are not changing TSI. So have a kind of bias towards the lakes that aren't changing, and the decreasing water clarity lakes are pretty much left out of the sampling. Now we do have the whole water set, or the whole data set. We can look at some spatial and temporal trends and things. We're basically taking the data we did with our manual techniques. So that's a late summer index period. And then we basically just calculated that same time period with the newer data. From that, we're able to look at trends, found that 14.3% of our lakes had increasing water clarity of 10 TSI was equivalent to a doubling or halving of algal biomass, or a doubling and a halving of the second disk reading. 6.6% had decreasing water clarity. And then if you take a smaller slice, 5 to 10 TSI units, about 18% had increasing clarity, and about 8.6% had decreasing clarity. If we look around the state, we see a lot of decreasing water clarity lakes out in the western part of the state. This is an area where the cropland has changed from small grains to corn and soybeans. In the Twin Cities, we see areas of lots of increasing water clarity. This is a area where there's some development going on, so you're converting farmland to suburban areas, and then when these developments are put in, they're required to do lots of BMPs, rain gardens, and stuff like that. So we have a lot of things going on. Plus, they have a lot of lake management, so there are alum treatments and lots of that stuff where they have the money to do that type of stuff, which isn't usually done out of state. Big concern I have for these results is the northern Minnesota here. There's a lot of lakes that are decreasing in clarity, and there's really not a lot going on in these areas. There's not, very low development and very low agriculture in this area. If we look at the chart over here, you can see that there has been a big increase in temperature. This is August, September temperatures. And there's also a wider swing in the precipitation, more droughts and more big storm events. We're looking at a global scale. We see that there, quite a bit of change in the northern hemisphere here. And so northern Minnesota is kind of the fastest warming, one of the fastest growing warming parts of the United States. Look just at Minnesota, yes, it is warmer in southern Minnesota than northern Minnesota, but if you're looking at change, the Lake of the Woods area is big hotspot for temperature change. If we look at it over a longer period of time, 1895 to 1985, there's kind of a consistent rate. It's about, it's kind of going back and forth, but it's fairly slow rate. That rate seems to have increased in the more recent years when we have the satellite imagery. About 5-fold increase in the rate of warming over this period. So that could be probably problematic. And this year, this doesn't include the 2023 yet, and so this has been a warmest year on record. So we'll see how that goes for the next year as well. You can look at the data in different ecoregions. Northern Lakes of Forest has more water clarity in the clearer end. Northern Central Hardwood Forest, more mixed bag, and then Western Corn Belt more in the lower end. Now I'm just a quick look lake browser, and I'm almost done here. So I'll bring up the lake browser. I'm just going to zoom into southern Minnesota here. We're going to just take a look. So here we have May data. We already have a few blooms starting in a few lakes. June, July, quite a few more. September or August more, and September. Oh, I forgot to do this. Hang on, I forgot to do one thing. Okay, let's do that again. Okay, so May, June. So now we're looking at chlorophyll instead of clarity. July, a lot more. September, a lot more. And in October, it starts to nest. I can click on any lake and get information about that lake and get a full report. We can see this lake is improving clarity. You see the seasonal trends of that lake, tabular data. We have all of our data, clarity, chlorophyll, and CDOM for all those measurements. Quite a few of them. And then you can rank the different water bodies, different delineations, and we have some land cover stuff. With that, we have a few minutes left, I guess, hopefully for some questions. And I'm going to start.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Leif and Clara and Scott. I don't want to rush us through questions. So if you three have time to hang out here for an extra 10 minutes or so, that would be great. We'll answer at least the couple of questions that are in the Q&A. So we have two here to start with. If anybody else has questions, feel free to add them. There's been a lot of data, high value data gathered by all of you and other scientists. Really, it comes down to, okay, so what and now what? What do we do with all of it? And then we have a question about increasing precipitation and shorter ice season. Will that affect lake levels throughout the year? And another question about landscape changes due to climate change and the increase in connectivity between lakes because of increased precipitation. So I don't know who wants to start, but let's start with that first one about the big question, the so what now what question.
That's the $10,000 question, isn't it? Well, it depends on what kind of world we're gonna live in, I guess. And if it goes the way the trends look like, I mean, this is going to continue to happen, at least in the foreseeable future. We would hope at some point it's going to get to a point where we're going to actually have to do something about it. So far, it doesn't seem that too much is happening, but maybe Scott or Claire have a bit much than that.
Yeah, maybe I could weigh in a little bit of who our stakeholders are in this conversation. So, I mean, we've looked at this question about, how does climate change affect water quality? In some cases, water quantity too. And a lot of people care about this. There's a lot of stakeholder communities that care about those two subjects. And some of the things that we've been finding, and I've been excited to see that both Claire and Leif are finding similar things actually, is one of that climate change isn't just air temperatures; it's related to rainfall too, and that a lot of it's about watersheds and watershed management. And so our stakeholder communities involve local governments. They involve the ag community. They involve the city and in its wastewater treatment process. And it's saying, hey, there's this really important links to climate change that we need to consider. And it's really important how we manage our watersheds, the land use on those watersheds. It has real implications to water quality. So yes, I would say there, in the so what, there is a lot of so what. It's really important. And then what's happening. I agree with Leaf. I think there's a lot more to go, but the conversations have started, and I think these things are already being factored into some of the decisions that are being made.
Yeah, I could jump in now about my project. So with respect to our stakeholders, the lakes that we picked, not just around Lake of the Woods, but we looked at other lakes in Ontario. They were often selected by our stakeholders because there were concerns with respect to shoreline development or lake management. People are concerned with enhanced shoreline development, is that adding extra risk to lake trout? And now we're not just looking at nutrients in this isolated system, it's with that added layer of climate change. So we're really trying to understand how that influences how we manage these systems. And in Ontario, there's often added protections for lake trout lakes. So we worked a lot with the government and other cottage associations to understand these dynamics so that people can, or municipalities or lake associations can understand what's happening and develop strategies to be protective for these cold water fish species. The so what, yeah, there's a lot to do with the so what. There big changes are happening and they're going to continue. And I think we can measure them now and it's going to proceed into the future. And so we're always going to be at a place where there's going to be more. And that's just the reality that we're in. But we know a lot now. And I think it's important that people are learning from it, which is great.
Thanks, all three. I guess I'll add in on the now what, building on what Scott said about taking this whole of watershed approach to discussions around land use planning, land use management, watershed management. That is part of the rationale for having my position as an international watershed coordinator, to be able to create that space and the relationships that will help us be able to do those sorts of activities, like having the relationships that connect municipalities with higher levels of government and resource managers and that sort of thing, and Indigenous communities and other groups around the watershed, so that we are able to have the conversations to plan for the future, given what we are learning from the science. Okay, let's answer Johan's questions and then we can probably wrap up. So Johan had a couple of questions here. One was about the impact of increasing precipitation and shorter ice season on lake levels throughout the year. And then the second one is, how do you expect landscape changes in the watershed due to climate change interacting with the increased connectivity with lakes due to increased precipitation? So some of those larger systems questions. Who wants to start that one?
Yeah, maybe I could start. So those are great questions. I think one of the issues, so if I'm on the increased rainfall, or what is this, the increased precipitation and longer ice-free seasons, how is that going to affect lake level? So certainly, a lot of the lakes we're dealing with are these small lakes high up in the catchment. And, every year they start off above what we call the sill elevation. That's the level of the outflow. And that sort of happens in a wet or dry year. In the really wet years, we can get an increase of a few feet in the lake level. That would be among the highest. But where I think it's really important is when you get to the lakes lower in that connectivity. So Rainy River and lakes that our lakes feed into, I've seen significant flooding in some of the recent past, and that's due to these sort of increased rainfall events. So this is really important, really critical. I'm not sure. I think the question about longer ice-free periods is a really good one that should lead to increased evaporation rates. I don't have the answer for that right now. That's going to take some modeling. Maybe Leif or Claire know more than I do on this, but this is how are increased rainfall and increased evaporation going to fit together to affect lake levels into the future? And I don't have a clear answer for that one.
Claire or Leif, either of you want to chime in on these ones?
Yeah, I do. My focus is more on water quality, hydrology. So, but I guess Yeah, we are looking at some under ice stuff, and maybe in a couple of years we'll have some good answers on that. But I don't. You know, I think every lake is different, so it really depends on the lake itself. But overall, there probably be some like everything else. There'll be some that'll be higher and some that'll probably be lower.
Yeah, in terms of, increased connectivity with changes in precipitation, I think an important part, I don't look at lake level exactly, but an important part of this is the seasonality component. In different parts of the province or areas, we see changes that are occurring more in the winter, like Scott mentioned. And so we have this added component of changes that are occurring at different times of the year than we'd expect them to, which then has trickle over effects into, when nutrients are entering the system. We see under ice blooms. There's all these other components that play into it. So it gets to be a little bit more complex. And I know that doesn't really answer your question on lake level, but it's an interesting one that's going to be big moving forward. And I think there's going to be a lot more that's going to come out of that question.
I feel like the story we're getting out of this webinar is the science that we know so far is really fascinating, and it's just leading to more questions than answers. There's so much that we don't know, and these systems are so complex. Then one change in any part of it triggers all kinds of changes throughout. It really is interesting. We have one last question from Todd that I think we should get to, and then I will wrap it up here. So Todd says that in the Red River case study, increases in phosphorus loading accompanied the increase in precipitation and runoff, but there's also extensive tile drainage in the Red River Basin during the same period. In the lower Rainy River subbasin, we're seeing an expansion of tile drainage, particularly on the Canadian side of the river. What thoughts or perspectives can you give on this for our future in the Rainy Lake of the Woods watershed? Leif, I feel like this is a question that goes to you first, maybe, and then Scott and Claire.
With the tiling, Minnesota, we do it. I mean, there's a lot of tiling going on in a lot of agricultural areas, and but again, I don't do the hydrology, but I do see the effects of the water quality. And, as you saw, southern Minnesota, there are a lot of eutrophic lakes, hyper-eutrophic lakes. And it can't improve the situation. I don't think if you're tiling everything, it's just basically increasing the flow of some of the nutrients into the lake. Is my thinking on it. Scott or Claire have a better answer than that?
I don't have a good answer for this one, so I'll pass it to Scott.
Well, I bring us back to the Lake Winnipeg example is that, this is a really big issue about, and this relates to climate change and the things we often don't think about, sort of rainfall. And that increased rainfall, as Todd, you're pointing out, increased connectivity with the watersheds and the potential for increased nutrient loads. This is a really big deal. Now, we saw in the Lake Winnipeg example how increased rainfall and increased flow did not even lead to reduced phosphorus concentrations, as one might have thought, through dilution. It actually increased phosphorus through surface runoff mostly. Now, tile drains, the idea is it should reduce particulate phosphorus loads, but increase soluble phosphorus loads as the water gets stripped off very quickly. One of our arguments for management is that, okay, it's totally understandable that farmers want to get water off their fields very early in the spring. But if there was a way to hold that water back in controlled structures through when you're using tile drainage, and then as the summer progresses and it gets drier, then there's the opportunity to use that water and the phosphorus that's stored in that water right back to your fields. So I think there's some opportunities here. And I would agree there's concern for sure, because the climate forecast suggests our region is going to maintain these high precipitation levels into the future. So I would say this should still be on the management radar, but it goes right along with flooding too.
I could add for a lot of the changes in agriculture in Minnesota are going, from the small grains to corn and soybean type crops, which are higher intensity and more nutrients into the water. So I'm assuming that's probably happened up in Canada too, but I don't know
All right, folks, I'm going to let everybody go. It's 10 after. Thanks for staying long. This was a great, really interesting session. I wish we could go on for a few more hours because I have questions too. But I think we'll probably end up circling back to doing this one, maybe even annually. I think a snapshot of climate change impacts in the basin is always timely. This year in particular, it's been a doozy of a year. And I will be really interested to watch future research to see what trends are emerging as the climate becomes more variable year on year in our region. But thanks so much to all three of you for your time today and your expertise. It's been a real pleasure. And thanks everyone who joined us today.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.